Today, we're going to look at a totally different way of thinking about Jesus. It's a view that doesn't just see him as a figure in history, but as the actual center of time itself. This is the revolutionary idea from a theologian named Oskar Cullmann.
You know, for centuries, Christian theology has been kind of stuck on one big question. What was Jesus? Was he divine? Was he human? Both? But what if that's the wrong question to begin with? What if the real key to understanding Jesus isn't about his eternal nature, but about his specific job, his role in time? And this is exactly where Oskar Cullmann comes in. He looked at all this and proposed a pretty radical shift. He said, look, the New Testament isn't really trying to answer Greek philosophical questions about nature and substance. It's way more interested in something more active, more dynamic. Jesus' function, his mission, his actual work within God's grand plan for all of history. To really get what he's talking about, we have to understand his central concept. It's a German word, but it is the absolute key that unlocks his entire way of thinking. Heilsgeschichte.
Heilsgeschichte. It basically means salvation history. And it's this idea that the Bible isn't just a random collection of stories and laws. No, it's one single unfolding story of God's saving plan for the world. And super important, it's not a circle. It's not cyclical like a lot of ancient thought. It's a straight line moving from a beginning towards a final goal.
And here is where it gets really interesting. Before Jesus, Jewish thought generally saw the big, decisive moment, the coming of the Messiah, as something still way off in the future. But what early Christianity claimed was that the decisive moment had already happened. Suddenly, Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection became this new center of gravity for all of time, literally splitting history in two. So this is what that new timeline looks like. You've got the age before creation, then the present age leading up to Jesus, then bam, Christ arrives. He is the midpoint. And his arrival kicks off the new age, which is the time of the church, the time we're in now, and this whole era continues until the very end, the final parousia. So you see, Jesus isn't the end of the story, but he is the absolute, irreversible turning point. Okay, so if the timeline of history has been completely recentered, how does that change how we understand who Jesus is? Well, let's take one of his most famous titles, Son of God, and see how it looks through this new lens of salvation history. So back then, the title Son of God wasn't some brand new thing. I mean, kings in Israel were called God's son, so were angels. But Cullmann says the New Testament takes this old title and just pours this completely new and unique meaning into it. It stops being a static label and becomes something that's revealed through what Jesus actually does. And you can actually watch it happen in stages. First, at his baptism, the Father confirms who he is and links that sonship to a mission. Then the temptation comes along, and it's a test of that sonship. Can he be perfectly obedient? Then his ministry shows this incredibly unique, intimate Abba or Daddy relationship with the Father. And finally, the resurrection. That's the ultimate public declaration of who he is. It's a story unfolding, not just a fact being stated. So what does this all mean, this historical, unfolding sonship? Well, this really gets to the heart of Cullmann's whole idea. It's about function, not metaphysics. You know, Jesus' own words in the Gospel of John just nail it. He says his very food, his sustenance, is to do the Father's will and finish his work. For him, sonship isn't about having the same stuff as God. It's about having the same will, the same mission. So this is the big takeaway. For Cullmann, being the Son of God means one thing above all: perfect obedience. It means Jesus' will and the Father's will are so perfectly aligned, they're basically one and the same. His actions are what revealed the Father. It's a sonship defined by what he does to carry out God's rescue plan. And this reality creates a kind of tension for us now. Cullmann came up with this brilliant analogy from World War II to explain it. He said the resurrection was like D-Day. The decisive battle has been fought, and it has been won. The outcome of the war is no longer in doubt. But the war isn't over yet. There's still fighting to do until V-Day, the final victory. We live in that already, but not yet time. Now, to really appreciate just how game-changing this was, we gotta see how Cullmann's ideas stacked up against what everyone else was saying in theology at the time. On one side, you have classical theology, heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. It was always asking about Jesus' substance and his two natures. It's a metaphysical question.
Cullmann comes along and just flips the table. He asks about Jesus' function and his role in the story. He wanted to use the Bible's own categories, not the categories of Plato and Aristotle.
This put him on a collision course with another giant of theology, Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann thought the biblical stories were basically myths, and you had to peel away the mythological husk to get to some timeless truth inside. But for Cullmann, that was a huge mistake. He argued that the historical events themselves, real stuff that happened in real time, that was the revelation.
So, okay, we have this tension between real history and timeless myth. What does that all mean for the relationship between the facts of history and the act of faith?
Well, for Cullmann, the Gospels aren't just history textbooks, but they're not fairy tales either. He called them revealed prophecy, which means they contain real historical facts that any historian can investigate, that a man named Jesus of Nazareth lived and died. But the central claim, that this specific man is the Son of God, the midpoint of all time, that's something a historian can't prove. That can only be grasped by faith.
All right, so let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways? First, understanding Jesus is about understanding a story, a grand narrative, not just memorizing a doctrine. Second, titles like Son of God aren't about his essence. They're job descriptions. They tell us what he does. Third, true sonship for Jesus meant perfect, loving obedience. And finally, we are all living in that fascinating, tense, in-between time, after D-Day but before V-Day.
Cullmann's work really forces you to see time differently. He says the whole arc of history bends towards and finds its meaning in Jesus. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question for ourselves, doesn't it? If the history of the whole world has a center point, what about the history of your own life? What's the midpoint that gives meaning to your story?